Ayaka was released in a time where Cryo was one of the most valuable elements in the game, as Hydro Shields were very prevalent, Freeze was incredible, and Dendro didn't yet exist. Between competition with one of the best DPS Ganyu, as well as being teased since the beta of Genshin Impact itself, Ayaka was released with extremely high expectations and did not disappoint, quickly becoming one of the very top DPSs in the game. With the release of Dendro and 3.0, however, both the Freeze reaction and Cryo itself have gone down in value. And as more powerful DPS have entered the fray, Ayaka is no longer as dominant as she once was. She is, however, extremely powerful in many scenarios, got some new incredible free-to-play tools from Fontaine, and is still extremely rewarding for the dedicated Ayaya enjoyer. So let's talk about whether you yourself should get Ayaka, and how to get the most out of her if you do. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Ayaka is a Cryo Sword DPS who does the majority of her damage through her elemental burst, and the vast majority of her teams revolve around giving her energy to charge it up and buffing her to make the most out of this massive chunk of damage. The burst is extremely front loaded, meaning that if the whole burst connects with enemies, it can do tons of damage very quickly. Normally this is done by freezing enemies in place after grouping them, and as long as you time it and play it right, she is very useful against both trash mobs or any freezable kind of AoE, as well as against bursting down bosses. If the bosses are mobile, however, and you don't utilize their enemy attack pattern knowledge, she can be very frustrating to play against bosses or mobile enemies, as a big chunk of your team damage is just liable to miss. Her elemental skill has pretty good multipliers on it and gives her quite a few energy particles. Her unique dash applies cryo to enemies, as well as giving her normal attacks a cryo infusion. This cryo infusion can be overwritten by the likes of Bennett at C6. Her normal attacks aren't the most insane damage, but they are solidly useful for doing extra damage while your team's skills are on cooldown. Because the only thing she needs to do in a rotation is her skill and burst, her field time requirements are very low, which means you have plenty of time to cycle through your entire team, generate lots of energy, use multiple skills on all of your team, reducing her ER requirements if you funnel properly, and reducing your team's ER requirements. Historically, she's been a character that's heavily reliant on specific characters for her premium team for her to function optimally, but has gotten a lot of options with the release of Farina and the Dark Horse option of Mono Cryo in general, so let's talk about her team. Starting with her premium team. It's not always her best team. When you're team building with Ayaka, just like when you're team building with anyone, you want to craft your team to fight the content you're facing. Ayaka is more than capable of fighting any content that's not immune to cryo, but this is most often the go-to team for most Ayaka players who have all the resources at their disposal. It is a team that consists of 4 5-stars. Ayaka, of course, Shenhe, Kokomi, and Kazuha. Kazuha is the most important part of this team. He's the least replaceable option. The grouping he provides is unparalleled, the damage bonus he gives is very, very important, and when you use his hold E, he applies enough animo that you can swirl cryo even if the enemy is fully frozen. Other animo characters can have trouble doing this. Kokomi is by far the most comfortable option. She can be replaced with Mona. I personally don't have Mona, so I haven't been able to test it myself. Some people do use Barbara. It's nice that her ring follows you around, but you have to really be hugging the enemy to apply Hydro. You need to run sacrificial fragments on her to make sure you get decent uptime on her skill. Overall, it's just very clunky and annoying to use, but it can be an option if you're waiting to get one of the other options like Mona or Kokomi later down the line. Xingqiu is an option that I actually don't mind. Even though you're running this team without a defensive option, Xingqiu does give you some damage reduction and it can be enough. However, lately the Abyss has been very punishing, and if you're not running a healer or a shielder, it can be tricky. It's also annoying because you have to always weave in normal attacks across all your characters to make sure you're getting Xingqiu's damage. It can be a good team if you play it properly, and I did use it for a really long time before I got myself Kokomi. Shenhe is another option, of course, that's replaceable. She can be replaced here with Ganyu, with Kaya, and with Rosaria. These are your more offensive options. You want to make sure you utilize Kaya's superior energy regeneration and battery your Ayaka and focus on more crit stats with your Ayaka. Ideally, Noblesse artifact set to buff your Ayaka, most likely Favonius Lance and to battery Ayaka, so overall, that's one of the main functions of the Cryo slot, is to give Ayaka energy. You can also go with a more defensive option, something like Layla, or like Diona, or like Charlotte. Diona has the most, and Layla does the most damage. Charlotte's arguably the most comfy. Mika doesn't really apply enough cryo or give enough energy to be really good, and Chi-Chi doesn't provide really any cryo or energy, so not the best choice. I did forget you can use Candace here on your final slot, but again, this is kind of an option like Barbara, where it's mostly a stopgap until you get something better. She infuses all of your characters with Hydro, so you want to be weaving in normal attacks with your characters. It's a bit better Hydro application than Xingqiu, but you lose a bunch of personal damage and you lose any form of healing. So it's definitely not recommended for the faint of heart, but it is something that I have used and that you can use. But again, not having a defensive option is pretty yikes these days in the Abyss. So that is her traditional archetype. Then moving on to the brand new archetype that Furina introduced, where you've got Ayaka, Furina, almost always gonna have to be Charlotte on this team, and then the animal slot becomes a lot more flexible than it used to be. I have Sucrose here just to show that you can do a more free-to-play version of this team. The awkward part is sometimes I'm not sure I'm getting my animal swirls on my cryo properly, so you might have to swirl. Well, basically you want maybe normal attack a couple times with Charlotte and then really quickly make sure you get your swirl with Sucrose. Basically, if the enemy is just frozen and then Furina applies some Hydro from off field, you could be in danger of missing your cryo swirl, which is really, really bad. Kazuha doesn't have this problem because he can just do his hold E and make sure you swirl. Venti also doesn't have this problem because his skill also applies 2 units of Animo just like Kazuha's does. You can also go with Jean, and then you're able to use a more offensive version in this slot. Instead of Charlotte, you can use Shenhe or Rosaria. Shenhe is great because, of course, she's buffing her Ayaka and it's more front-loaded. I'll talk about more of the differences between Shenhe and Rosaria in my rotations guide section, but Rosaria gets buffed by Furina and Shenhe buffs Ayaka more, so both are good on this team. Just remember, if you do use Rosaria or Kaya or someone else on the Shenhe slot, make sure you build them heavily for damage, as they'll be a good portion of the team's damage. One option that I see talked about very rarely and hated on a lot is Mono Cryo. It's an option that I happen to really, really, really like. It's my favorite for when enemies, when you don't get a lot out of freeze. I build my Layla on Harbinger of Dawn, and I give her HP with lots of crit, HP with lots of crit, or you can go cryo damage bonus, and then I do have a crit damage mask. And so overall, she ends up with a really good crit ratio from the Harbinger of Dawn. And because you're only spending time on her to do her skill, which is a shield, and her burst, she's never going to take damage, so she's always going to have high enough health to activate her passive. So she actually does a lot of damage, especially if you get C6. She does irrelevant buffing at C4, so it's really her personal damage that's what you want, and you get lots of energy overall on this team because you're usually going to be running Kazuha on Favonius. I have him on Sacrificial here, but normally you run him on Favonius for these teams. But yeah, I really, really like Layla on Mono Cryo. I think it's super, super slept on, really good for unfreezable enemies. Sure, you're not always going to hit every tick of your Ayaka burst, but if you know enemy attack patterns, you often can get the majority of your burst to connect on boss type enemies. You just have to use it when the boss maybe just finishes their move animation, and so now they're going to be stuck in one place for a bit, and you have to plan out your burst accordingly. This team kind of requires Shenhe to actually be really, really good. If you're not going to be using Shenhe and if you're going to be using someone like Bennett instead, or you're going to be using someone like Rosaria instead, you'll generally want to replace Layla with Bennett, so that Bennett can also buff your Rosaria. You can do this type of team with Bennett here, but I personally just like using Layla more. You're more mobile, you don't have to stay in Bennett's circle, you don't have to think about elemental application. Mono Cryo is a very brain dead and very comfy team, and if you don't believe me, give it a try. I've always got incredible clear times on any boss rush chamber, and this is definitely my go-to team when I want to use Ayaka and freeze isn't good. Maybe I'll go over the rotational stuff now. When you are using Bennett, you want to make sure to use Ayaka's burst, of course, inside the Bennett circle. You want to make sure you swirl Cryo before you place down Bennett, as he will remove the Cryo there. So normally your rotation is going to be use Shenhe's skill, Kazuha skill, Bennett burst, Kazuha burst. This will infuse Kazuha's burst with Pyro. Now you can melt a few Ayaka hits. It's not going to be a crazy amount, but you're going to get some melt here and there. Then you're going to want to use maybe Kazuha's skill again, then Shenhe's skill again, and that's generally what you want want to do overall to get good rotations with Shenhe is you want to begin the rotation with Shenhe's skill and burst, then do the rest of your stuff. So maybe then do your Ayaka stuff, then swirl with Kazuha, then use Kokomi's skill. You want to use Kokomi last because if she's holding the Thrilling Tales, then you can pass the Thrilling Tales buff to Ayaka. You can also run Sacrificial Fragments on Kokomi to make sure you have 100% uptime in an easier way than running enough ER to get her burst, but you're going to get more damage overall by using the Thrilling Tales one, but it can be pretty comfy to use Sacrificial. My biggest recommendation for rotations is to watch people with good clears, because even if I give you the perfect rotation, you're not always going to be able to do it. So learning how to do the rotation yourself, watching other people do it on Abyss clears, there's tons of Abyss clears. Obviously in this video, my Abyss clears are decent, but there's tons of people online doing really fast runs, and that's how you're going to see optimal rotations and start to learn for yourself how to make things line up. But the big thing for Shenhe teams is to get 2 skills for rotations. You want to start with your skill and burst, then right after using Ayaka's burst, you're able to use Shenhe's skill again. So that gives less energy needs for Shenhe, as well as double the quills for your Ayaka burst. Sometimes you can swirl a second time with Kazuha before going into Shenhe, just depends on what your rotation's looking like. You can also go full on reverse melt with Xiangling and Bennett. I found this team okay. I definitely wouldn't specifically recommend it, but if you don't have Shenhe and you want to use her to kill bosses, this can be a pretty solid option. It's not incredible synergy because Ayaka applies her burst in so many different ticks, so rather than applying one big hit of damage that can be melted, it's a lot of different ticks, so not really recommended. I would personally just go for Mono Cryo instead, but yeah, if you don't have Shenhe, then this is a solid option. The other good option for single target is Hyper Bloom, and it's going to be what are people calling it, Hyper Fridge when you're using a cryo unit. On this one, if you're running a Mistsplitter Ayaka, you may have to go ER Sands to get any form of burst uptime, or you can just use your burst whenever it's up. Aminoma has an easier time. You're definitely going to be bursting less because you don't have a cryo battery. When you're using Farina, it'll buff Ayaka more. I think Yelan's probably still the better choice overall. If you're using Farina, make sure to use Prototype Ambra and Nahida so that you get some decent healing stacks, but I would generally just go with the Yelan or Sing Cho variant. This is a solid option for the second half of this Abyss, especially when you want that Electro application for Simon. I was able to pretty easily brute force the second half with Mono Cryo, but especially if you're lower investment Ayaka, like your artifacts aren't as good yet, then this is a decent option. So overall, what are my recommendations for teams? Like, should you aim to get this premium team, or should you go with the more free-to-play friendly Farina version where you can run Sucrose, just make sure you're getting your cryo swirls, or you can run Venti, or you can even run Lynette, depending on how much you need grouping. I still like the premium team the best, and I especially like it because it gives me the option, like having Shenhe gives me the option to switch Kokomi out for Layla. So I think if you're a die-hard Ayaka fan, then getting Shenhe is worth it for the flexibility of being able to run Mono Cryo. But if you're not a die-hard Ayaka fan and you're not like dead set on using her in every Abyss and you just want to use her on a freeze team when freeze is good, then I think it's much smarter to go with this team, because most free-to-plays, they're already going to be getting Farina, they're already going to be getting Kazuha. If you vertically invest, you can vertically invest in Farina, which makes your whole account more valuable, whether vertically investing in just Ayaka only makes her teams more valuable. If you have both Kazuha and Venti, this is a great way to utilize Venti. You can, of course, run Venti on the other team, but losing the damage bonus hurts, whereas on this team, because you get so much damage bonus from Farina, it doesn't hurt nearly as much. It's also really nice if your Ayaka is not as well invested to have another character who's doing a lot of damage on the team, namely Farina, and you can build Venti for damage as well, so his personal damage is actually relevant, being buffed by Farina. So I think this is like the more efficient route to go, whereas Ayaka is the more die-hard, or Shenhe is the more die-hard Ayaka route to go. But I can definitely see a lot of people who aren't like dead set on using Ayaka all the time to just go for this variant, because most people are going to be getting Farina anyway. For her build guide, this is a character that scales off of her stats. She doesn't really do reaction damage, she does raw multiplier damage, and is generally a hyper carry, meaning that the vast majority of the team damage goes through her directly. As such, getting her level to 90 is worth it in the long run. It's not going to be the first character you go to 90, of course. Spread and Aggravate and Hyper Bloom and Nilu Bloom and Animo Swirl reactions benefit much more from level 90 than Ayaka does, but if you're planning on maining Ayaka, level 90 eventually is worth it. For talents, Burst by far, I would recommend, you know, getting your Burst to level 9 or a level 10 for a character like this that so much of the team damage comes from the Burst. It has such high scalings, it hits so many times, is definitely by far the most valuable part of her kit, followed by her skill and then her normal attack. Personally, I like my setup of 8-8-10. I feel like it's a good balance of efficiency and power, but I probably will take my skill to level 9 eventually when I have the resources. For the weapons section, I'm going to be referring to the Kaching Main's Ayaka guide. They did a great weapon breakdown. It's very updated and they have the weapons ranked. Number 1, the Mistsplitter Reforged. It's about 13% better than the Haran, which is what I'm using on this video. Very close to the Jade Cutter. The thing about the Jade Cutter is that you get so much crit rate that it's very, very difficult to build properly. You do have that problem with the Haran, but the Haran gives less crit rate and gives a damage bonus and higher base attack instead, which is preferable. The Light of Foliar Incision, much easier to build with. You might have this. If you do, it's a solid choice. Summit Shaper, solid choice. High base attack, very, very valuable for Ayaka. Something we'll talk more about in the substats and the artifact section. But coming up very, very, very close to the 5-star options is the Finale of the Deep. This is the free-to-play Fontaine craftable. You'll definitely want to get this if you don't plan on pulling 5-star weapons. It's an amazing weapon. Being 11% better than her other free-to-play options is huge. It puts it within 17% of the Mistsplitter and within just 5% of the Haran, or less, 4%. And the Haran is what I've been using, and I found her very powerful with the Haran. It does require you have a healer on your team, so Charlotte or Kokomi, but really, really, really amazing free-to-play option. Skyward Blade also on here. Aquila Favonia surprisingly higher than the Aminoma because of its high base attack, even though the physical damage bonus passive is useless. Aminoma, really good option. Reduces your energy requirements by about 40%, basically meaning that you don't have to have any ER at all. But it is a bit more flexible than the Finale of the Deep because you don't need to run a healer on the team. And if your artifacts are just giga cracked out with crit rate, crit damage, energy recharge, and you don't have, crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent, and you don't have any energy recharge, then this could be a better option for you, because if your burst isn't up, then what's the point of playing Ayaka? But for me, I would definitely recommend going for the Finale or going for the Mistsplitter, because that extra damage on a hyper carry like Ayaka, she does the vast majority of the team's damage. So increasing that team damage by 11%, really, really big. And of course, by 27% over the Aminoma is really, really big as well. If you're still waiting for those billets to drop, the Ishin from Kazu's Story Quest is a great option, performing about as well as the Aminoma. Really going to depend whether or not you have the ER substats, whether this or the Aminoma is better. But I'd say mostly it's just an option you want to go for if, like I said, you have a lot of ER or you just don't want to use your billets. But the long run Finale of the Deep for the dedicated free to play. Looking at artifacts, Blizzard Strayer, Blizzard Strayer, Blizzard Strayer, Blizzard Strayer, almost always going to be the best. Sure, if you have Jade Cutter, it could be better to go for 2-piece Blizzard Strayer, 2-piece attack or something like that. But as much as you can, you want to make Blizzard Strayer work. You want to have attack Goblet, crowd damage, or attack Sand, crowd damage bonus Goblet. You can go attack Goblet if you have Farina on your team, and then crit damage Mask. If you have a giga cracked Ayaka and you have Mistsplitter and you have a ridiculous attack percent circlet, you can use that as well. But generally, it's always going to be crit damage, crowd damage, and attack. For substats, you want to first focus on getting ER. I have 117%. It's not quite enough. I think that her energy needs are maybe a bit overblown, but maybe I'm just losing out on potential damage and rotation damage from having way too low ER. You generally want at least 130, if not 140 energy recharge to have optimal, nice rotations. If you are running on the low side, you're definitely going to be wanting Favonius on your second Cryo character. You're definitely going to be wanting Favonius on your Kazuha. So yeah, my team is super inefficient with its energy management, and the clears you're seeing could be improved because I'm really not efficient with my energy. I'm not living what I'm preaching here. For other substats, yes, you want less crit rate, but I think people really go under on the amount of crit rate. Like, yes, you don't want to overcap on crit rate, but going up to 100 crit rate, as long as you don't go over, going up to 100 is ideal, because sometimes like you won't have a perfectly frozen enemy and you'll still wanting to be getting at least 80% crit rate. You don't want to aim for a total of 85. You want a total of at least 90, 95, if not 100. So let's count how much crit rate you want to have. You get 40% from a fully active Blizzard Strayer plus 15% from Cryo Resonance. So you want to have, so that's a total of 55%. So I actually am overcapping on crit rate by a decent amount. You want to have 45 crit rate. I wouldn't go less than 40 though. I would stick to a hard line of 40, especially if you like using her in mono cryo like I do. Even overcapping a bit is not the end of the world if you do like to use her mono cryo. If not, of course, then you definitely don't want to be overcapping. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that attack is really, really, really valuable. Having attack percent substats is almost as good as crit damage substats. So a piece like this, which has ER and attack with my amount of crit rate, is way better. So don't just tunnel vision on crit rate, crit damage. Look for attack on your pieces. You will be glad you did. I'm going to talk about vertical investment here when you're looking at what's more worth, because Ayaka has a lot of options. You've got constellations that are really good. You've got Shenhe, who's really good for her, and you've got her 5-star weapon. So what is the best way to improve your Ayaka? In my opinion, these days, Shenhe is actually the first vertical investment piece that you'll want to go with. That's for 2 reasons. Number 1, she allows the teams to be a bit more flexible, especially if you want to use your Ayaka for bossing. Being able to front load much more damage with Shenhe is very, very valuable. And the difference between Amenoma and Mistsplitter, which was the previous difference that you had to gauge whether or not it was worth it, and the difference between Finale of the Deep and Mistsplitter is much, much smaller. So the relative gain that you're getting, like Finale of the Deep with Shenhe versus Mistsplitter without Shenhe, Shenhe is catching up and probably the overall better choice for higher damage for your team. Shenhe does fall off in AoE content with a lot of enemies, but a lot of enemies, it's usually trash mobs, and that's usually not that hard to beat. It's mostly the really chunky enemies when there's just like 1 or 2 of them that are more difficult, like the 2 consecrated beasts or something like that, and they're more resistant to freeze, so front loading your damage is more important. So I think Shenhe is just the better pick for your first vertical investment piece. But the second vertical investment piece would definitely be her weapon, the Mistsplitter Reforged, because Shenhe scales based on how well your Ayaka's stats are. I guess that's another consideration. If your Ayaka artifacts are Garbo, then Mistsplitter is going to give you better returns because Ayaka scales with how well, or Shenhe scales with how well your Ayaka is invested. So if your Ayaka is not well invested, Mistsplitter will take her to the next level more than Shenhe will. Once you have Shenhe and Mistsplitter, then you can start looking at her constellations. Her C1, pretty much useless. Her C2, pretty solid. C3, obviously quite good. And C4 is her C6. Her C6 isn't real. It's okay, but her C4 is where you want to go to. I personally will never go any higher than Seed 0. I'm more than happy with Shenhe, and I will be getting Mistsplitter for her just so I can test it out. But I personally also really like the option for running mono cryo with Shenhe, as well as the front loaded. Plus Shenhe is super hot, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I really do honestly think that she's the better choice these days. Alternatively, you can ignore everything I just said and not focus on Ayaka's damage, but focus on Furina. Getting Furina and then going for her C2 is a more valuable account-wide option. So you can forget about Ayaka's weapon, you can forget about Shenhe, and just hyper invest into Furina. This is perhaps a more valuable way to approach your account if you just want to min-max things. But here's the thing, Ayaka is not like a min-max character in the first place. Like if you're getting Ayaka, it's because you love Ayaka, not because you want the strongest account possible. Not saying that she can't be one of the top DPSs and stuff like that and be really, really good. She's just not the most efficient way to get there. There's better ways with Novelette, Furina, Alhaitham, etc. You're likely getting Ayaka and wanting to vertically invest in her teams because you love Ayaka. Getting Shenhe, getting Mistsplitter is not going to be as account-wide valuable as Furina, but it will be ridiculously powerful and you'll storm through the game forever. For overall power level and value, I think Ayaka is in a solid 1 tier below the top, whether you consider that tier 1 or A tier, whatever, when S tier is the best. I don't think she's an S tier character. She's definitely an A tier, up there with the best DPS. She's not I think if you have her Shenhe, if you have her weapon, she gets close enough to AYAYAYAYA that it doesn't feel like a big downgrade. I would like, at least she's in the same tier. She's in the same tier as Hu Tao. She's in the same tier as AYAYAYAYA. She's in the same tier as Novelette. I think they're all very, very close to each other. I think that the disadvantage for Ayaka is her burst can miss. So it can, if you're not willing to be finicky and reset here and there or make sure that you're doing it right, it can be annoying to have her burst miss. So that kind of quality of life can make her go down, especially since freeze isn't as useful as it once was. I still think she's way underrated for bossing. And so I don't think that she, you know, is very much worse than those other characters at all. I think they all belong in the same tier to me. Account value, however, is a different story. So power level, she's up there with the best. Account value, much lower. There's definitely more efficient ways to get here, right? To get to your Ayaka with your Mistsplitter, with your Shenhe, and blah, blah, your Kazuha, blah, blah, blah. There's more efficient ways to get here. So and Cryo isn't, at least at this point, an element that's really, really valuable. But if you love Ayaka, you're going to be very happy. You want to, you know, invest in high performing artifacts and weapons and all this stuff. But so she's not a valuable pull. She's only a character that you go for if you like her. But most DPSs are, the vast majority of DPSs are, even AYAYAYAYA, I would personally put into this category. I would put Hu Tao into this category. I would put Novelette. I think because those characters have so much more teams, especially Novelette, that they are more valuable than Ayaka, but still a DPS, as Mtash says, a DPS is a DPS is a DPS. You get her because you like her and because she's strong, not because she's the best thing possible for your account. Versus others, how does Ayaka stack up versus Wriothesley versus Ganyu? I definitely think there's no question about it. In the Abyss specifically, Ayaka outclasses Ganyu. I've seen some crazy clears with Ganyu, but they definitely don't match the ease of use. And I know it's ironic because we said that her burst is hard to use, but Ganyu is really hard to use and very technical to really get her top clears. I definitely think that for the Abyss, Ayaka definitely clears Ganyu. I know people out there love your Ganyu. Hey, I'm not saying Ganyu's weak, and I'm definitely going to get a lot of people disagreeing with me, but based on what I've tested and what I've seen, and I do have R2 Amos bow, I have the first great magic, I have 4-piece Wanderers for her, which obviously I'm not using right now, but my Wanderers pieces are very good, right? And I've built her up to be very good, but she's not as good in the Abyss. In the Overworld, Ganyu clears for sure, not even close. I think that Ayaka and Wriothesley definitely belong in the same tier. So if you have Wriothesley and you're like, oh, should I get Ayaka? Is she gonna be better? No. Like, Wriothesley, I think, trades a little bit of ceiling damage, which I think Ayaka has, for much more comfortable damage. I think that Wriothesley and Ayaka definitely belong in the same tier. I think Ayaka is only very, very slightly higher peak, but probably less comfortable to play. Probably maybe a lot of people will enjoy playing Wriothesley more. And there's also, you know, maybe my perception is flawed because when I tested Wriothesley, I wasn't using his signature weapon. The majority of the Wriothesley testing I did was before Farina, and my talents aren't as high as my Ayaka talents. I did factor that in when I made this analysis, but just take that with a grain of salt. Regardless, I definitely think they're both in the same tier, not a question. Versus other characters like Rosaria, I mean, she's no question an upgrade to someone like using Rosaria as your cryo DPS, but if you have a well-built Shenhe, well-built Kazuha, and a Kokomi, making a team with Rosaria as the lead instead is going to be great. You're still going to be able to clear with Rosaria. I've cleared with Chongyun as well. Kaya's solid as well. So again, not a character. She definitely clears these characters in terms of damage, but still, if you just, you know, say you like Rosaria more and you're like, oh, I don't know, should I go for Ayaka just because she's a better cryo? If you love Rosaria, just stick with Rosaria, you're going to be fine. For future prospects, how will Ayaka age? I mean, I think she just got a really nice glow up in terms of her floor, in terms of how free-to-plays will perceive her. I have a hard time seeing her ceiling get way better unless like maybe we get more options, more animal options in the future. Maybe we get new defensive Hydra options. We just have so many 5-star Hydra characters already. I think we just got the biggest update we'll see for Ayaka for a while. I expect her to stay a top DPS forever, and she's got lots of tools, you know, enjoy what you have here, I think. For Overworld, I actually really like Ayaka. Of course, you're not going to be using her burst very much in the overworld because enemies just die too fast. It's mostly her skill and normal attacks, but her traversal over the water, her reduced stamina consumption, her faster traversal time, not as good as Yelan or something like that, but still solid for the overworld. I think she's a great overworld choice. Not as good as Ganyu in the overworld, but I still personally like her as long as you're not just dead set on maximizing her burst in the overworld, and you're gonna kind of switch your playstyle to more of a normal attack and charge attack playstyle. Finally, for aesthetic, I love her original aesthetic. The samurai thing just really does it for me. I love the samurai vibes. Her alternate skin, I like it, but I don't love it. It's one of the few skins for characters that I play that I haven't actually got. It's not that I hate this skin, I just like her normal one so much more. Any updates to this guide will be in the pinned comment. Bye for now.